Welcome back to the layout. This is Dan here, and this edition of my weathering how-to videos, we're going to be discussing some more weathering techniques for a different freight car this time. You'll remember in the previous installment of my how-to, we covered the basics of a covered hopper, and I showed you a variety of techniques to accurately weather a plastics hopper. And in this edition, we're going to be discussing tank cars. Another important prototype to railroads. Any mixed manifest, any freight, local freight, whatever, it's almost always going to have tank cars on it. So what I'm going to be doing in this video is weathering a tank car. And what we have here is an Athearn Genesis 20,000 gallon acid car, Geo Tax 163060. This is a beautifully detailed, excellently done model. The ends are die cast. It's got all the nice piping details, the coupler bars, the air hoses. You got the shelf knuckle couplers on the ends, beautiful etched metal walkways, great detail. This is a really nice car, and when you weather these, I'm telling you, they look really good, particularly the Athearn cars, because they're so nicely detailed. What I do want to keep in account, though, a very important note on these cars is the level of detail. You have to be very, very careful when you weather these. I can't specify enough how you have to be very careful, because what can happen, especially with me, being that I'm going to be that my technique, I prefer hand weathering my cars. It's very, very well. Let me explain in a different term. When you get under here, like on the underbody of the car, where all the majority of the piping is. Taking a brush in there, especially trying to weather around the truck area, around the bolsters and coupler boxes, you have all those pipes connecting into this area here. So going in with a brush, you can actually damage these very, very easily. You don't even have to, it only takes just a little application in the wrong area, and you can bust one of these pipes off right quick. So you have to be very, very careful. Another big area is on the ends where you have these coupler bars and air hoses. Those are very, very delicate detail parts, and you have to handle those with extreme care when weathering. So that's just the heads up for this. If you're going to weather a tank car like this, any kind of tank car that's going to be detailed to an extent like the Athearn Genesis cars are, you have to be very, very careful. Now for airbrush weatherers, they're in a little bit better shape than I am in this case, because they don't even have to touch those piping. They can just spray everything and it's not going to affect anything. So it's actually slightly better to airbrush these cars, but the problem is it lacks, well, I'm not saying that it's a bad technique. You can do a lot of great stuff with airbrush weathering, but you'd still have to go back and try to apply the hand weathering effects like corrosion and such, which wouldn't be a bad thing, but in this case, I like to go in a little more detail with my hand weathering, because it gives me a little more freedom to model heavier areas of rust patching and stuff. Things that you normally can't model with an airbrush. So we'll go over this. Now, one last thing I want to go over just real quick is on the Athearn cars, and not so much the Atlas cars, never mind, but particularly on the Athearn cars, they usually are treated with like a semi-gloss finish to kind of have like that satin sheen that they have, and you can actually very slightly see it in this video. You can see the slight sheen that it has. It's nice if you're modeling a brand new car, but in this case, when we're actually weathering one that's been in service for a few years now, that can be an issue when weathering, because with acrylic paint, it can actually come off very easily with this finish because of the gloss on it. It can actually scratch too. And how to remedy this is, what you're going to do is you can take some dull coat finish and give it a good once over on the car, top to bottom, and that'll pretty much give it some tooth for when you weather. If you were to just weather it like right now, you'd actually have a harder time weathering it, because it would take a lot longer to build up the layers. So that's just another little thing I wanted to note on this. On other brands like Atlas tank cars or Walthers ones like this one here, the 23,000 gallon or the 16,000 gallon cars, Walthers cars don't really have that. Some of the newer ones though I've seen, like their new Trinity ethanol cars, their newer models have that satin finish. But the older ones I've noticed really don't. And I've been able to weather those relatively easily without this issue. But the newer ones, you might want to do the same treatment if you're weathering an older car or anything like that. So that's just something to take into consideration as well.
Oh snap! You thought I was going to just weather this car. Well, sorry, we're not.
There's some important things we need to go over in terms of prototype reference for weathering this tank car.
Let's go over to the other bench and discuss it a little further.
Okay, so over here on my other bench, I'm going to just take a 1 minute to discuss weathering tank cars. I want to specify prototype reference for this. I've seen this so many times where someone will weather a tank car not knowing what it carries or anything along those lines, and they either weather it too dirty or too clean. And I want to try to make this as easy to understand as possible. With prototype reference, you're trying to accurately weather and portray one of these cars. And I'm actually going to start here. I got several examples for tank cars. I don't have all my tank cars out here. These are only just a few. Most of mine are actually still in storage at this point. But I want to basically have a few examples laid out here. And I'll basically go over and discuss the weathering I've done on these cars, so you can kind of understand a little bit better how to weather these. So to start, I have a Tlx car here. This is a Walther 16,000 gallon funnel flow car, and these are a little bit confusing for one thing, because they actually cars like these don't have the hazmat placards noted or anything. Plus, they are not stenciled for what they're carrying, and that can be a little tricky when weathering them. The best way to determine what they're carrying is to look them up online to try to find out. And in this particular case, this car hauls a chemical solution, and I don't know the exact terminology for its name right now, but it's a chemical solution. And these cars are actually relatively clean, but they do get a little dulled down. When these are factory painted, they have a really bright, fresh finish to them, nice and glossy. But rather quickly, they usually fade down, and they do get a little rusty as well. So as you can see on this car, I've dulled it down, and I've also added a little bit of rust. You can see a fair amount of grime on the trucks. An important aspect when weathering a tank car too is that the trucks usually are going to get the most grime. Alright, and another note on these cars is that if you is prototype reference for these. In this particular case, again, I used a real photo. If you can't find the real photo of a car like this or anything like that, you can use other photos of sister or brother cars, and you can kind of get the basic idea. Most of them look about the same. In very rare occasions, though, have I ever seen like radical differences between prototypes. So it's a great way to kind of determine, how dirty these kind of cars get and whatever. Trying to keep it as accurate as possible. And we'll go ahead and move on to the next car, which is this little acid tank car here. Another Athlon Genesis car. Now, just a side note on these. This is an acid car, but this is a relatively newer acid car. This one, I think, was freshly repainted by Union Tank Car back in 2010, so the paint is still very glossy, so you can see I kind of tried to preserve that, and I just lightly weathered it in a few areas. Now, on acid cars, they get very, very dirty. The acid, the corrosion. When tank cars are painted usually like this, they have an industrial coating that kind of helps to prevent corrosion and stuff like that. But after a while, it'll wear off. And a lot of times what happens is you'll see acid spill over the sides, and it kind of drips down the sides, as you can see. And up top, sorry about that, guys. There we go. And you can see up top, you can kind of see that some of the once painted metal roof walk, the etched metal at the top has kind of now been eaten away, and it's just back down to bare metal now at this point. You can see that a little bit of acid spill is starting, and usually with acid spill it's usually either a really rusty color or it's like a whitish color like this, and it usually has like a powdery buildup at the top. But in this case, since this etched metal piece is here, I couldn't do anything like that, so I just kept it like it was and did a little load spill. So again, this is a more modern car, but the older ones get the dirtier, the most corrosion and stuff, and you'll see a few of those examples in a minute. Now the next car, like this one here, is for a little lighter job. This is a corn syrup car, and these usually stay relatively clean. They can get dirty, but in most cases they're really not too bad. You know, the wheels, couplers, stuff like that, that's what's really going to get dirty. The car bodies stay pretty clean. So I kind of tried to achieve some load spill here. I did the corn syrup spill with some decal setting solution. Usually when it dries it has this glossy finish to it, so that is great for weathering or simulating the corn syrup spill over the sides. But when weathering a corn syrup car like this, you want to keep these relatively clean. Now, another example here, this is actually another corn syrup, or rather vegetable oil car, an older one. This was built in like the 80s or 90s, I think, and you can see it's very dirty. It's kind of corroded, you know, kind of out of date, probably on the verge of retirement. And when an older car like this, you want to weather it pretty substantially, again referring to prototype photos so you can accurately portray these. But since it's an older car, it is relatively beaten up and it's pretty dirty compared to the newer car like this here. And by the way, this is an Atlas car, and so is this. These are both Atlas cars. And moving on, we'll go ahead and focus on another acid car here. This one is another relatively older car. This one is a Geo Tax Car, and you can see it's been in service for a few years now, and you can see the heavy corrosion at the top of the car. I'll zoom in a little better so you can see it. You can see that heavy rust-colored corrosion coming down from the hatch, spilling over the sides. And this is I think it's I'd have to look over here again real quick. I think it's fluorosilicic acid is what this is, and it's highly corrosive. So this effect is pretty common on acid cars. I've seen it a lot of times, and on this particular car it has this big streak. So I modeled that. It was covered in graffiti, so I tried to simulate some of the tags. Some of them are free-handed and others kind of made up, but I tried to simulate them as best as possible to make them look semi-accurate. Now we get into a car like this blue car here, and this is actually it's another version of a 20,000 gallon car. These happen to be both 20,000 gallon prototypes, but they haul different materials. This one carries flammable liquid. I can tell by the placards that it's labeled for an explosive material, most likely gasoline, propane, anything explosive like that. And these kind of cars usually get very dirty as well. This is an older one, so you can see it's very grimed up, it's very dirty. You got rust spots, you got deterioration, you got a lot of rust coming down from the railings up top. So when you're modeling a car like this, it's good to usually weather them relatively heavy. Some of the newer cars, like if you've seen some of the longer ones with the railings up top, like labeled for Procore or anything like that, those are the newer ones and those are pretty clean. But an older car like this, they usually are very, very dirty. And this one's blue, so I had to fade it a little to get it kind of toned down a little. So any like a colored car like that is usually going to be very dirty as well. Moving on, we got a few other different chemical haulers. In this case, these are two, well, I have two kaolin examples here. What these haul is kaolin, or basically clay, a clay slurry, and it's used in paper making, stuff like that. And with these cars, the substance is very, very chalky, and when it's put in the cars, it's usually in the form of a slurry, when it's mixed with water. And it gets very, very dirty. The cars get dusty, and a lot of the kaolin streaks over the side coming down, and you can see on this one it's very, very, very dirty. Weathering wise, they're very clean, but what makes them look older than they really are is the fact that this kaolin clay just gets all over everything. It's on the trucks, the couplers, the fronts. Every inch of this car, or any one of these cars, is usually very dirty and covered with the clay slurry. And this is a semi-newer car, 16,000 gallon car. That's usually what these are, 16,000 gallon prototypes. But you get into an older, like ACF built car like this one, and again you can see I tried to have two examples here for a newer car and an older one to kind of give you two examples of the same car. And on this one you can see, since it's older, it's got a good bit of rust spots. It's slightly rusty, it's got a little bit of kick up at each end, but overall not too heavy, but still focusing a lot on the clay spillage, especially on the trucks and on the sides. So moving on, we have some acid cars. Now these ones are kind of fun to model because they usually are the most dirty, and in this case this is why I decided to model one of these, because of how dirty they get. So it kind of gives me a little more to cover in terms. So I have this one here. This one's, you can see, I kind of experimented with this one. I tried to do what they call a half and half car, where it was an older car, it was very dirty. The acid kind of eroded around the top of the roof around the roof and stuff. And what they did was that they ended up basically masking off the top area and then repainting it with an industrial coating, which is this glossy white, which I simulated with several coats of gloss. I know you can't see it very well in the lighting. The sun's basically gone down here in Ohio right now, so you really can't see the gloss as well as you could if it was direct sunlight. So you can see what I tried to model here. Now, I probably should focus on these cars in the back. You get into banded cars like these, also acid haulers. You can see that I kind of try to keep, again, relatively clean cars, but try to focus the most on the acid erosion at the tops. And the same for this one and the one over there. Now, this one right here is a pretty heavily weathered example, and you can see the major corrosion around the top. I think this is a fluorosilicic acid again, which is highly corrosive compared to, say, like hydrochloric acid. It's pretty bad stuff. You don't want to get it on you or anything, but it just eats away the paint on these cars, and it's very, very filthy. And this is an older GATX leased car, so you can see again I tried to model and focus on the corrosion from the top of the acid coming down. Now, a car like this, if you're modeling a sulfur car, these are pretty easy because they all are equally nasty. Molten sulfur is, not that it's corrosive, but the cars themselves usually are very dirty because some of them are usually very old. So you can see an example here. I tried to create some like blotchy effects on the yellow band of this car, and you kind of try to fade it down, get a little rust. And it's important to add the sulfur spill to the top. You can see this one's got a big deposit of sulfur spill there, kind of dripping down the sides. A lot of times on these sulfur cars, the load usually spills over. On this one, you can see a little more sulfur spill, and so on and so on. You can see this is another older car right here. So as you can see, I kind of tried to dust it off look, and then I kind of just, kept the load spill relatively minor. But again, most of these cars, they're usually very dirty. So if you're modeling anything like asphalt, phenol, molten sulfur, anything like that, weather the cars very heavily. And again, refer to prototype photos so you can accurately weather them. So now that with this in mind, well, before I actually move on, it's good to mention that there's hundreds of different types of tank cars out there hauling different things, and these are only a few examples. Again, there's a majority of chemicals that are hauled by rail, so it's good to have prototype reference when modeling a car. And now for actually weathering the tank car. I'm going to be using my material of choice again, acrylic paint. I like it because you can get it in bulk for one thing. I have my white here, which we'll be using for highlights. And it's real cheap too. You can get this at like Hobby Lobby or a fine art store for like maybe 79 cents a bottle. The bulk stuff costs about $1 or $2, but in the long run it's definitely worth the investment, the small investment, if you're going to be doing a multitude of cars like I do. So I have my basically my white, and it's just white. And I'm going to be using that for highlights and some dust effects later in the final stages of weathering the car. I got my flat black, also in use as acrylic, which is great, especially when we're going to mix it together with our earth brown right here. Basically the cornerstone of any weathering job I do is going to be earth brown or burnt umber. In this case, since this is a lighter car, I'm going to be using the earth brown. And for rust effects, in particular corrosion, I'm going to be using a slightly brighter orange than you remember the jack-o'-lantern orange I was using originally for like rust and stuff. This is going to be for a heavier bit of rust, and we're actually going to probably mix a little bit of this together with some earth brown to create some nice corrosion acid spill effects later on. And for brushes, I'm going to be using a really simple palette here. I got my fine brush for the detail weathering, which will come later on. I got my medium brush here, or kind of my finer brush, as you can see, a soft bristle brush for doing the wheels and some other things later. I got my really my basic weathering brush here, and then this brush here will be used for sorry about that. My soft brush again will be used for highlights and dust effects. And then finally I got my medium brush. As you can see, it's a little beat up, but it still works just fine. This will be used for the rust patches also, which we'll show.